All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast. If the hot seat for Billy Napier was hot at the start of this college football season, what can you say about it right now? Following Saturday's home loss to Texas A&M, Florida is now 1-2 on the season, while they are just 12-16 overall under Napier. Napier has never had a winning season at Florida, and to me, the turning point for Napier began following last season's late season home loss to Arkansas. That was an Arkansas team that they couldn't get out of their own way. They just kept losing. And that was a game right there that a lot of people expected Florida to win. They didn't win that game. They would go on to lose their last five of that season, finish 5-7. And of course, that helped to ignite the current hot seat for Napier right now in Gainesville. So you began this season, if you're Florida, with a blowout loss at home to Miami. Don't get me wrong, Miami has a very good team. Some people think that they could win the ACC, but if you're a Florida fan or a Florida booster, you don't want to hear that. Okay. But then Saturday's home loss to Texas A&M with a backup quarterback. And remember, if you go back and watch this game, A&M dominated the first half. They were up 20-0. And, the folks at Ben Hill Griffin let Billy Napier hear it as he and his Gators left the field at the half down 20-0. So for me, that right there is not a good sign. When the home fans are booing and we're still here in mid-September and the fans are already looking to see who they can bring in next. And then on top of that, it really is not a good sign if you're Billy Napier when the alumni, or you're hearing multiple reports at least about the boosters, they're already getting the money ready for his buyout. Okay. So with all of that said, is there anything that Napier can do at this point to save his job in Gainesville? And I'm going to say absolutely not. Why? Because I don't foresee Florida turning things around this year. They arguably already had the toughest schedule coming into this college football season. You've lost two out of your first three games at home. Okay, you got to go to Starkville to take on Mississippi State this Saturday. Then you come back after a bye week. You got Central Florida at home, and there are some people who do believe that the Knights are going to be among the upper echelon teams in the Big 12 this season. You still got to travel to Knoxville to take on Tennessee. You got to host Kentucky, okay, next month. A Kentucky team that has really turned the tide, if you will, in this head-to-head matchup between Florida and Kentucky. Of course, it was, a series that had been dominated by the Gators for so long, dating back to the time of Steve Spurrier. But then you look at this in consecutive weeks for Florida in the month of November. You take on Georgia in Jacksonville. You're in Austin to take on Texas. You then host LSU. You host Ole Miss, and then you're at Florida State. And of course, well, things ain't looking too good for Florida State right now either. But you just look at it. Georgia, Texas, LSU, and Ole Miss in consecutive weeks. All four of those teams have designs on getting to the college football playoff this year. This is how deep that the Southeastern Conference is. Okay, and I'm going to touch on that Ole Miss game a little bit later. But I will say this. My bigger question right now is whether or not Napier makes it through the entire season. That's how bad things have gotten for me, in my opinion, or at least for him, rather at Florida. So you look at the Gators, and I mean, this is a Florida fan base, a Florida, alumni boosters, everybody. They want to get back, okay, to where the Gators were. And you think back to when Steve Spurrier was the head coach at Florida. It was basically a given that Florida was going to get to Atlanta for the SEC championship game because that's how much they dominated. It didn't work out like that under Ron Zook. Urban Meyer got them back to that. And of course, Urban Meyer is responsible for 2 national championships in Gainesville with this club. But you think about it, they tried it with Will Muschamp. He showed flashes, didn't come all together. Then on top of that, they brought in Jim McElwain. Jim McElwain did have some success. He got Florida to a couple of SEC championship games, lost to Alabama. The third season wasn't too good, and Florida went in a different direction. Then you bring in an Urban Meyer assistant and Dan Mullen. Dan Mullen had immediate success. Florida was 10-3 in his first year. They got to the Peach Bowl. He did get them to an SEC championship game back in 2020, but after a 5-6 campaign in 2021, he was let go. They brought in Billy Napier, and the rest is history. Knicks 100. What's going on? You're saying the problem with the SEC is they get extra credit for losses. They're usually overrated to begin this season, then get credit for the losses. I'll tell you like this: the SEC is still one of the premier leagues in college football. You just added to that by bringing in Texas and Oklahoma to the fray. But I didn't. My thing is this with Florida: I did not expect Florida to be one of the top teams in the SEC this year. You look at it, and this is not in any exact order. You've got Texas, you've got Georgia, you've got Alabama, you've got LSU, you've got Tennessee, you still got Oklahoma. Okay, that's just 6 of the 16 teams that I've named right there that are contenders for the postseason. I mean, and when I say the postseason, I mean the playoff. I mean, you got I don't think I mentioned Ole Miss right there as well. But you got quite a bevy of teams that are currently in the top 10. Of course, they're going to knock each other off, but it's kind of that gap, if you will, between the haves and the have-nots right now in the Southeastern Conference. And unfortunately for Florida, they're in that have-not category, and they want to get back to the haves. And it's so important for you to find that right head coach. And it looked like they had that guy in Dan Mullen, but after the one bad year, and of course the struggles against Georgia really didn't help the situation. But maybe they should not have let Dan Mullen go. Okay. Because now, if you're Florida, they're going to go out there and they're going to swing for the fences because they want to keep up with the Joneses. And I'm sure that the boosters around this program, they're tired of seeing their team, you know, not finish with a winning record. They're tired of seeing their team getting kicked around by Georgia because you think about it, for about 15 years or so, Florida dominated the Florida Georgia rivalry. Right now, it's really tough to call it a rivalry because Georgia has just dominated, not just, of course, what they've done to everybody else, but they just dominated Florida. And, the Georgia Florida game, unfortunately, if you are the SEC and you're Florida, it's become an afterthought. Okay. So I'm sure the folks there are tired of seeing that. I'm sure that the folks in Gainesville are tired of not making that trip to Atlanta, not making those trips to those premier bowl games, not being thought of, okay, in the college football playoff mix. Florida has never made an appearance in the college football playoff. When you think about this, they won 2 BCS championships. You go back to the Steve Spurrier era, they were always a premier team as far as getting to the big bowl games. And all of that, unfortunately, has gone by the wayside. Big reason for that, Florida has struggled, okay, in recruiting their own state. And you think about that. The state of Florida, when it comes to high school ball, extremely talent rich. But they're watching places like Georgia come in there. They're watching places like Alabama come in and other schools as well. And they're taking that premier talent out of the Sunshine State. Florida's got to get themselves a head coach that is going to basically secure Central Florida, get those top kids from high school in that region to come to Gainesville, get the top kids in Florida, period, to stay within the state. This is what they're going to have to do going forward. So you look at it, and who might be on that Florida radar for next season? Well, I'll tell you like this. I think one name to keep an eye on is going to be Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss because Ole Miss doesn't have the Florida money. And I think Florida, like I said, they are going to want to swing for the fences. They want themselves a rock star. And you look at Lane Kiffin, and Lane Kiffin has been that rock star at Ole Miss. And I think if Florida wanted him, I think they could go out there and make a full court press to make it happen. You think about it, each of the last two off seasons, Lane Kiffin has flirted with getting other jobs or talking to other schools just to get more money out of Ole Miss. Maybe they get tired of that act. Maybe Florida says, you know what, this is our opportunity. But again, if the boosters around this program are already getting the money together for a buyout for the current head coach, I do believe that they're going to swing for the fences. I think Lane Kiffin could be on a short list. Another name to keep an eye out for, possibly Ryan Silverfield at Memphis. You think about the job that he has done there. We just saw Memphis go to Tallahassee and knock off Florida State this past Saturday. Take it for what it's worth. But, Memphis is the favorite to win the American Athletic Conference, and they are looking like that team so far. Maybe Silverfield can come and bring some of that magic from Memphis to Gainesville. Another guy that I'm going to put on my list, Gus Malzahn. And the reason why I say it is this: Gus Malzahn is currently at Central Florida, and the Knights under him, they're 27-16. But you think back to when Gus Malzahn was at Auburn, he was 68-35 in 8 seasons there. He got them to the national championship game once. He got them to the SEC championship game twice. They did win the Southeastern Conference one time. He was 3-5, okay, against Nick Saban in Alabama. And that's better than a lot of other head coaches can say at that time. We've seen that what Malzahn does can work in the Southeastern Conference. So would he possibly be on the radar of Florida? Maybe. Okay. And I'm also going to put Jamie Chadwell from Liberty out there. You think of what the job that he has done with the Flames so far. Maybe he could bring some of that magic to Gainesville. We'd have to wait and see. So these are just some guys that I'm just throwing out there as possibilities to be the next head coach of Florida. But nonetheless, I do think Lane Kiffin would be at the top of that list. It's going to take the right guy with that right sprinkle, with that right magic to get Florida back to where they want to be, which is rubbing elbows with the top dogs in the SEC. You got Georgia there with Kirby Smart. You got Steve Sarkisian at Texas. Okay, you've gone from Nick Saban to Kalen DeBoer at Alabama. Florida wants to be in that mix. Okay, and especially when you have a program that they've had multiple Heisman winners, multiple national championships, and you think about it in recent years, aside from not even getting a guy drafted in the first round, he may be here or there. They're not getting a lot of guys drafted, period. Okay. And this was something where you consistently saw the Florida guys hearing their names called, during the NFL draft proceedings. And that's something that they've gotten away from. So again, I think the writing is on the wall. It's not a matter of if, it's more like when Billy Napier is relieved of his duties. And I think the process has already started for his replacement. Winning in the SEC is not easy. You think about it. I know Nick Saban, this is the first year that he's not at Alabama since 2006, I believe. Okay. But you think in the time that Nick Saban was at Alabama, you think at how many head coaches lost their jobs during that time. And it's one of those where it's a league where you really have to keep up with the Joneses. And if you don't produce, guess what? They will turn on you very quickly. I think people gave Napier the benefit of the doubt for the 6-7 campaign in 2022. Did get them to a bowl game. They lost 5-7 last year, and then a 1-2 start this year with two bad home losses. Listen, you could be a nice guy, but at the end of the day, Florida doesn't want a nice guy that's not going to win ball games. It comes down to what you do or don't do on Saturdays. And unfortunately for Napier, his Florida teams have not won enough. And with that said, like I said before, it's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when the Gators make that coaching change. So, folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank all of you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take this time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you haven't already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on the X, formerly known as Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it will be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365. You can check it out. Drop a line and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. Knicks 100, as always, it was a pleasure, my man. Thank you for the support and thank you for chiming in. And to everybody else out there, as always, my name is William Martin. I'm signing off and I'm saying thanks once again for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. Be well, everybody.